The cold did not creep in gently. It arrived in silence, settling over the land sometime between dusk and dawn, unnoticed until it was already everywhere. One evening, the air still carried the memory of warmth. The grass bent easily beneath the wind, and the sky felt open and wide. By morning, the same land had hardened, breath turned visible, sound travelled differently, even the light felt thinner, sharper, as though the world itself had tightened. On the Great Plains there were no mountains to block the wind, no forests to soften its force. The cold moved freely, sweeping across open ground with nothing to slow it down. It pressed against skin, slipped through seams in clothing, and tested every weakness it could find. This was not the kind of cold that stung briefly before retreating. It stayed, it waited, it demanded attention. Inside a hide-covered shelter, the air felt heavy and still, yet cold all the same. The warmth of sleep lingered only for a moment after waking, fading quickly as movement began. Layers of bison hide rested over bodies like quiet guardians, holding on to heat that had taken hours to build. When one layer shifted, even slightly, the cold noticed immediately. It rushed in, sharp and impatient, as if offended by the barrier that had kept it out. Outside, the land had changed its voice. Footsteps no longer sounded soft. They crunched, brittle and loud against frozen ground. Snow, thin but stubborn, clung to the earth in pale patches, reflecting the early light. The wind carried no scent now, only dryness and distance. It brushed across the plains without resistance, carrying cold from faraway places no one would ever see. This kind of morning was dangerous, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it arrived without negotiation. The day before had offered no warning, no gradual shift, no gentle cooling. Nature on the plains did not explain itself, it simply acted. Those who lived here understood this well. Surprise was not new, but it was never taken lightly. The body reacted before the mind fully caught up. Muscles tightened, shoulders lifted slightly, instinctively protecting the neck, hands curled inward, conserving warmth. Breathing slowed, becoming deliberate, careful not to pull the cold too deeply into the lungs. Each inhale felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself carried weight. There was no panic in this awareness, only focus. Panic wasted energy, and energy was precious. Calm was survival. Movements remained measured, even as the cold made everything feel urgent. Small actions mattered now, how a hide was adjusted, where feet were placed, how long skin was exposed to the air. The fire at the center of the shelter offered only a suggestion of warmth. Its glow was low, almost shy, embers pulsing softly beneath ash. It had been kept alive through the night, not allowed to grow, not allowed to die. Fire was not comfort. Here, it was balance. Too much attention could smother it. Too little would let it fade. The cold watched closely, ready to claim any mistake. Beyond the shelter walls, the plains stretched endlessly, pale and unforgiving. This land did not provide shelter easily. There were no trees to gather around, no fallen branches to break and burn. Everything that offered protection had been prepared long before this morning arrived. Nothing was left to chance now. The cold pressed against the hides, searching for gaps. It found seams, edges, places where materials met and bodies shifted. It slipped through in thin threads, testing patience and resolve. Yet inside, warmth remained, not abundant, not effortless, but present. It existed because it had been earned. Generations of memory lived quietly in every choice made that morning. Where to sit, when to rise, how long to remain still before moving. These decisions were not discussed. They did not need to be. They had been learned slowly, over years, through observation and experience. Winter had taught these lessons many times before. Outside, the sun climbed higher but offered little help. Its light was weak, filtered through cold air that refused to carry warmth. Shadows stretched long and sharp across the ground. The day would be bright, but never gentle. Brightness did not mean safety here. The cold had a way of making everything feel closer. Sounds carried farther. The smallest movement felt louder. The world seemed to listen more. Carefully during winter, as if waiting for weakness, waiting for waste, waiting for impatience. Inside the shelter, bodies shifted closer together without thought, not out of fear, but understanding. Warmth was shared instinctively. It moved from skin to skin, passed quietly like a secret. This closeness was not discomfort, it was reassurance, proof that life continued even when the land seemed determined to challenge it. Morning tasks would begin soon. Food would need to be prepared, clothing adjusted, plans made for the day ahead. None of this would be rushed. Winter punished haste. Everything would be done slowly, deliberately, with attention given to every detail. Survival depended on it. The cold remained constant, unmoved by human presence or effort. It did not grow angry. It did not show mercy. It simply existed, vast and indifferent. But those who lived here had learned something important over time. The cold could be endured. It could be understood. It could even be respected. This morning was not the first like it, and it would not be the last. The land had turned many times before, shifting from warmth to ice without pause. Each time life adapted, not by fighting the cold, but by moving with it, adjusting to its rhythm, accepting its rules. As the day slowly unfolded, the cold stayed close, a constant companion. It shaped every decision, every movement, every breath. Yet within that frozen stillness, there was quiet confidence, the knowledge that this moment had been faced before, that it would be faced again, and that, somehow, warmth would remain where it mattered most. The land stretched outward in every direction, wide and open, with nothing to interrupt the horizon. No forests stood waiting to be entered. No branches swayed overhead. The sky felt larger here, pressing down gently but constantly, as if reminding everyone below how exposed they truly were. On these plains, trees were not something to be searched for. They simply did not exist. In warmer seasons, the absence felt almost peaceful. Grass rolled like waves, bending with the wind, catching sunlight in soft motion. But in winter, the openness revealed its true nature. With nothing to slow it, the wind travelled endlessly, gaining strength as it crossed frozen ground. It carried cold from distant places, delivering it without delay or mercy. There was no shelter to retreat into, no wooded edge to soften its reach. Firewood, something many would consider essential, was never part of daily expectation here. The people of this land did not wake each morning hoping to find fallen branches or dried logs. They knew better. The plains offered different gifts, and survival depended on understanding exactly what the land could give and what it never would. Looking across the frozen grass, it was clear that nothing grew tall enough to block the wind. Snow collected unevenly, drifting low against the ground, sculpted by constant movement of air. Every feature of the land, Scape was shaped by exposure. Even sound behaved differently, travelling farther, clearer, unhindered by trees that might otherwise absorb it. Without forests, the idea of building warmth from burning wood never took root. There was no sense of loss in this. You cannot miss what was never promised. Instead, attention turned to what was available. The land was honest in its limits, and those who lived here learned to be equally honest in their needs. The absence of trees shaped everything: homes, clothing, movement, and thought. Shelters were not built tall. Height invited wind. Instead, they remained low, angled, respectful of the forces that moved across the plains. Every curve and seam served a purpose. Every decision acknowledged the reality of open land. In winter, the plains seemed quieter, yet more alert. The wind carried faint sounds from far away, distant movement barely visible against the pale ground. There was nowhere to hide for anyone or anything. This openness demanded awareness. Eyes scanned the land constantly, not out of fear but habit. Survival here depended on noticing subtle changes. A shift in wind direction, a change in the texture of snow, a difference in how cold settled against the skin. Without trees, even shadows felt scarce. When the sun dipped low, it cast long, thin lines across the snow, stretching from bodies and shelters alike. There was nowhere for darkness to gather heavily. Night arrived openly, spreading evenly across the plains, uninterrupted by forest edges or tangled branches. The lack of firewood did not mean the absence of fire entirely. It meant fire was rare, controlled, and deeply respected. Flames were never allowed to become careless companions. They were tools, used when necessary, never wasted. The land had taught restraint long before winter arrived. People moved differently here. Without wooded paths or sheltered trails, movement followed the shape of the wind and snow. Travel was planned carefully, steps measured to conserve energy. Every journey considered distance, weather, and daylight. The land offered no shortcuts, only wide truths. In this open world, community mattered deeply. With no forests to separate groups or hide individuals, people depended on one another for warmth, safety, and survival. Isolation was dangerous. Togetherness was practical. Camps were arranged with intention, shelters positioned to protect one another from wind, bodies clustered not only for comfort, but for shared strength. Children grew up knowing this landscape intimately. They learned early that trees were stories from elsewhere, not part of their reality. Instead, they learned to read grass, snow, and sky. They learned where animals travelled, where wind cut hardest, where cold settled deepest at night. Knowledge replaced what the land did not provide physically. The plains also shaped patience. Without the distraction of dense forests, time felt slower, more deliberate. Winter days unfolded quietly, marked by subtle shifts in light rather than dramatic changes in scenery. People learned to sit with stillness, to listen to the wind without expecting it to stop. At night, the stars felt closer, sharper against the dark sky. With nothing rising from the ground to interrupt the view, the heavens stretched endlessly overhead. This vastness brought perspective. The cold felt smaller beneath such an expanse, not weaker, but part of something larger. Living without trees required acceptance rather than resistance. There was no point in wishing for forests. Survival depended on aligning life with the land as it was, not as one hoped it might be. Every generation carried this understanding forward, passing it quietly through observation and example. Winter tested this relationship more than any other season. The cold exposed weaknesses quickly. Mistakes were costly. But the absence of trees had already taught the most important lesson: reliance on adaptability, not abundance. The land did not change for those who lived upon it. It did not soften its edges or offer comfort out of kindness. Yet within its limits life found balance. Warmth came not from burning wood, but from knowledge, preparation, and connection. In this treeless world, survival was not about conquering nature, it was about knowing it well enough to move within it without harm. The plains asked for awareness, humility, and patience. Those who listened learned how to endure winters that seemed impossible. The wind continued its endless journey across the land, carrying cold without pause. The grass lay still beneath snow, the sky remained wide and unbroken, and within this open, unforgiving space, life persisted quietly, shaped not by what was missing, but by what had been understood. Shelter on the plains was never meant to impress the eye or please the senses. It existed for one reason alone: to keep life going when the land turned hostile. Beauty, in the way it is often imagined, had no place here. Warmth, protection, and survival mattered far more than comfort. These homes did not rise tall against the sky. Height invited wind, and wind carried danger. Instead, shelters remained low and grounded, shaped by careful understanding of the cold. Their forms blended into the landscape, offering as little resistance as possible to the forces that moved across the plains. The wind passed over them rather than through them, sliding away instead of tearing inward. Every structure followed the same quiet logic. Rounded shapes replaced sharp angles. Sloped sides deflected wind rather than catching it. Openings were kept small and deliberate, positioned away from prevailing gusts. Nothing was accidental. Each design choice reflected generations of learning, refined through countless winters. The materials came directly from the land. Animal hides, thick and heavy, formed walls that breathed without allowing heat to escape easily. Beneath them, carefully arranged layers created pockets of trapped air, turning simple materials into powerful insulation. The ground itself became part of the shelter, often dug slightly below the surface to escape the worst of the wind and cold. Inside, space was limited. This was intentional. Large rooms demanded more warmth than could be provided. Smaller spaces held heat naturally, allowing body warmth to build and remain. The air felt close, but never oppressive. It carried the quiet presence of those inside, shared breath rising and falling steadily. There were no wide windows to invite light. Openings were controlled, covered, and adjusted carefully throughout the day. Light entered when needed, but warmth was never sacrificed for it. Darkness was not feared here. It was accepted as part of winter's rhythm. The floor beneath felt firm and cold at first touch, but layers of hides and grasses softened it quickly. These layers served as insulation, separating living bodies from frozen earth. Sitting, sleeping, and working all happened close to the ground, where warmth gathered most easily. The center of the shelter held a small fire pit, not as a source of constant heat, but as a tool. Its presence was modest, its purpose focused. Flames were kept low, feeding on whatever fuel could be spared. Smoke drifted upward, escaping through a small opening that doubled as ventilation. This balance between air and heat was delicate and well understood. Sound behaved differently inside these homes. The wind's howl softened into a distant presence. Moo. Tead by layers of hide and earth. The outside world felt farther away, as though separated by more than just walls. This quiet allowed minds to settle, conserving not only physical energy, but mental strength as well. Furniture, in the way it is known today, did not exist. Everything inside served multiple purposes. Bedding became seating, clothing doubled as blankets, tools rested close at hand, arranged carefully to avoid unnecessary movement. Efficiency guided every choice. Heat gathered naturally where people gathered. Families positioned themselves intentionally, sitting close, sleeping side by side. Body warmth spread slowly, steadily, filling the small space. Over time, the shelter held on to this warmth, releasing it gradually rather than allowing it to vanish into the cold night. These homes were not designed to impress visitors or offer luxury. They were built for endurance. Comfort, as modern people understand it, would have been a liability here. Softness invited carelessness. Excess space invited cold. The walls bore marks of use, darkened patches from smoke, stretched seams where hides had been adjusted and readjusted. These were not flaws. They were signs of life, evidence that the shelter had done its job through many seasons. Outside, winter pressed constantly against the structure, testing it with wind and frost. Inside, life continued in quiet rhythms. Breathing slowed, movements remained careful. Time passed differently within these walls, measured not by hours, but by light and warmth. Children grew up within these spaces, learning their boundaries instinctively. They knew where warmth gathered, where cold lingered, where not to sit too long. This knowledge came not from instruction, but from living daily within the shelter's logic. As night deepened, the shelter became a small island of life in a frozen sea. The cold did not disappear, but it was held at bay. The walls did not fight the winter. They worked with it, shaping space in ways that allowed warmth to survive. These homes were not symbols of comfort, they were expressions of understanding. They reflected a deep relationship with the land, built on acceptance rather than resistance. Winter shaped them, and in return they shaped how life endured. When storms passed and temperatures dropped further, these shelters remained steady. They did not promise ease, but they offered safety. And in a world where winter showed no mercy, safety was everything. Animal hides were never seen as simple coverings. They carried warmth, protection, and memory all at once. On the plains, hides were among the most valuable materials a community possessed, not because they were rare, but because they demanded respect, skill, and patience to prepare correctly. When winter arrived, their importance became unmistakable. The hide of a bison was thick, heavy, and alive with purpose. Even after it had been cleaned and treated, it retained a quiet strength. The dense fur trapped air close to the bow, while the tough outer skin blocked wind and moisture. This combination created a barrier that modern materials still struggle to replicate. It was warmth shaped by nature itself. Preparation mattered as much as the hide itself. Each one was worked carefully, stretched, softened, and treated until it became flexible without losing strength. This process took time and attention. Rushing ruined the hide. Neglect weakened it. Those who prepared them understood that their work would one day stand between life and the cold. Once finished, hides served many roles. They formed the outer walls of shelters, layered carefully to overlap and seal gaps. They became blankets, cloaks, and ground coverings. A single hide might protect a body at night and serve as insulation beneath it by morning. Nothing was wasted. Each piece earned its place through usefulness. Layering was the key to their power. One hide provided warmth. Several created a system. Air became trapped between layers, forming invisible pockets that held heat close. The cold pressed against the outside, but it struggled to move inward. These layers turned stillness into insulation, making quiet the strongest defense against freezing air. Clothing made from hides followed the same principles. Garments were designed loose rather than tight. This allowed warmth to gather between skin and fabric, creating a personal climate that moved with the body. Sleeves were long, collars high, edges reinforced. Every seam was intentional, placed where movement would not weaken protection. Even the direction of the fur mattered. Worn correctly, it guided wind away, rather than letting it press inward. Snow slid off instead of melting and soaking through. Moisture, one of winter's greatest dangers, was kept at a distance. At night, hides transformed sleeping spaces into pockets of warmth. Layers were arranged carefully, heavier ones placed outward, softer ones inward. The order mattered. Too much weight inside could press warmth away. Too little outside allowed cold to creep in. Balance was learned through experience, adjusted night after night as conditions changed. The smell of hides was familiar and grounding, carrying traces of smoke, earth, and animal life. It was a scent associated with safety. Wrapped within these layers, the outside world felt farther away, its dangers muted. Children learned early how to handle hides. They were taught not to drag them carelessly, not to leave them exposed to moisture, not to fold them in ways that weakened fibers. Respect for materials was woven into daily life. These hides were not objects, they were guardians. Hides also carried stories, marks from past winters, repaired seams, darker patches from long use. All spoke quietly of survival. Each piece had endured cold before. Wrapping oneself in it felt like inheriting that endurance. Even in moments of movement, hides continued their work, travelling across frozen plains, cloaks wrapped tightly, edges tucked and secured. The weight of the material provided both warmth and stability, resisting sudden gusts of wind. Movement slowed, becoming deliberate and efficient. When hides aged or weakened, they were not discarded thoughtlessly. Older pieces found new purposes: extra insulation for the ground, windbreaks near entrances, padding around vulnerable areas of shelters. Their usefulness faded gradually, never abruptly. The cold respected hides in its own way. It pressed against them, tested them, but often failed to pass through. Wind slid across fur. Frost gathered on the surface while warmth remained inside. This quiet resistance allowed life to continue when temperatures dropped beyond what skin alone could endure. Animal hides represented a partnership between people and the land. Animals provided more than food, they provided survival itself. This understanding fostered gratitude rather than excess. Nothing taken was wasted, nothing used was disrespected. Through long winters, hides remained constant companions. They shielded bodies, softened the ground, and shaped shelters. They carried warmth when fire could not. They turned stillness into safety. In a world without trees and firewood, these layers of fur and skin became walls, roofs, and blankets. They did not offer luxury. They offered something far more valuable: the quiet, steady protection that allowed life to endure through the deepest cold. Warmth on the plains was not something that flickered or danced. It did not crackle or glow brightly in the dark. It breathed. It moved slowly. It came from living bodies pressed close together, sharing what little heat they could create and holding onto it with care. Fire had its place, but it was never the center of winter survival. Flames were uncertain, fuel was scarce. One careless moment could turn a small fire into wasted warmth or dangerous smoke. Bodies, on the other hand, were constant. They produced heat quietly, steadily, as long as life remained. Inside shelters, space was arranged to bring people together naturally. There were no wide gaps, no unnecessary distance. Families slept side by side, children tucked between adults, elders positioned where warmth gathered most easily. This closeness was not forced, it was instinctive, shaped by understanding rather than comfort. Body heat worked best when it was shared. A single person alone lost warmth quickly. Two people together lost less. A group created something stronger, a small pocket of living warmth that the cold struggled to break apart. Over time, the shelter absorbed this heat, holding onto it like memory. Movement was gentle and intentional. Sudden motions released warmth into the air where it disappeared quickly. Stillness preserved it. People learned to move only when necessary, to shift positions slowly, allowing heat to remain close. At night, breathing became part of the warmth. Each exhale carried heat into the small space, building layers of warmth that settled around sleeping bodies. The air inside the shelter felt different from the outside, heavier, calmer, alive. Clothing played its role quietly, trapping body heat rather than creating it. Layers worked together with the warmth produced by muscles and blood. Even when the fire faded to embers, warmth remained, sustained by life itself. Children learned early that warmth came from staying close. They curled naturally toward others, seeking heat without being told. Elders, whose bodies produced less warmth, were positioned carefully, protected by younger, stronger bodies around them. This was care expressed through placement, not words. During the day, tasks were planned to maintain warmth. Work was shared, allowing bodies to stay active without exhaustion. Too much effort led to sweat, which turned dangerous in the cold. Too little movement invited stiffness and loss of heat. Balance was everything. When the wind pressed harder against the shelter walls, bodies responded instinctively. People leaned inward, shoulders touched, blankets were adjusted. These small actions kept warmth circulating where it was needed most. Fire, when used, supported this system rather than replacing it. A small flame warmed hands, softened frozen food, and dried damp materials. It never became the primary source of heat. Relying on it entirely would have been a mistake the land could not forgive. Even during travel, body heat remained the main defense. Groups moved together, stopping close, resting in tight circles. The Colonel noticed isolation immediately. Togetherness confused it, slowing its advance. In moments of rest, quiet filled the shelter. No one spoke unnecessarily. Sound carried energy, and energy was warmth. Silence preserved it. The rhythm of breathing, slow and steady, became the soundtrack of winter nights. This way of living shaped emotional bonds as well. Warmth was shared without hesitation. No one was left apart. Survival required trust that others would remain close, that heat would be shared, that no one would be forgotten. Over long winters, this closeness became normal. It felt safe, grounding. The cold outside might have been vast and unforgiving, but inside warmth remained human, familiar, alive. Heat did not need to be created from nothing. It only needed to be protected. Bodies provided that warmth, naturally, quietly, without demand. In a land where firewood was absent and flames unreliable, life itself became the strongest source of heat. And so, night after night, winter after winter, warmth flowed not from fire pits, but from hearts beating steadily in the dark, holding cold at a respectful distance through nothing more than shared presence and care. Fire was never taken lightly. It was not something to be relied upon or taken for granted. On the frozen plains, fire was a tool of precision, not comfort. It existed on the edge of necessity, used only when its purpose was clear and its cost understood. Fuel was limited and unpredictable. There were no piles of logs waiting to be split, no forests to supply endless warmth. Every source of fire had to be gathered with intention, carried with care, and used sparingly. Dried animal dung, bits of brush carried from far distances, and small pieces of preserved material became precious. Nothing burned without reason. Inside the shelter, the fire remained small and disciplined. It did not roar or crack loudly. It glowed softly, barely more than embers most of the time. This was enough. Too much flame wasted fuel and created smoke. Too little let the cold creep closer. Maintaining this balance required patience and attention. Starting a fire from cold coals was an act of quiet skill. Hands moved slowly, feeding the embers just enough to wake them without smothering them. Breath was held steady. There was no rushing this process. Fire responded poorly to impatience. The fire pit sat low, close to the ground where warmth could spread gently without rising and escaping too quickly. Heat travelled outward, touching hands, drying damp clothing, warming food just enough to be safe. It was never meant to heat the entire shelter. That responsibility belonged to bodies, hides, and structure. Smoke management was just as important as flame control. Too much smoke filled the space, stealing breath and energy. The opening above allowed it to drift upward and away, but only when the fire remained small. Large flames overwhelmed this balance, turning warmth into danger. Fire was used for moments, not how. Harshest. Hands were warmed briefly, then withdrawn. Food was prepared efficiently, never lingering over unnecessary heat. Tools were softened, not burned. Everything about fire use was intentional. When night deepened and temperatures dropped further, the fire was often allowed to fade. Embers were covered carefully, preserved rather than fed. Warmth from bodies took over, steady and reliable. Fire slept while people remained warm without it. Children learned early that fire demanded respect. They were taught to watch it, not play with it, to understand its value, not its beauty. Stories carried warnings quietly, reinforcing lessons without fear. Fire also carried risk. One mistake could damage precious hides, weaken shelter walls, or consume limited fuel too quickly. In winter, errors could not be corrected easily. Fire was helpful, but unforgiving. During storms, fire became even less reliable. Wind shifted smoke unpredictably. Fuel burned faster. In these moments, people relied even more on their shelters and shared warmth, allowing the fire to remain minimal or untouched. Outside the shelter, fire was rarely used at all. Exposed flames lost heat quickly to wind and cold. Cooking and warming were done inside whenever possible, where heat could be controlled and preserved. The absence of fire did not mean darkness or discomfort. The soft glow of embers offered enough light to see faces, hands, and movement. Shadows moved gently across hide walls, calm and familiar. Fire was Neve, the heart of winter survival. It was a quiet assistant, stepping in when needed and stepping back just as easily. Depending on it entirely would have been dangerous. Trusting it too much invited loss. This restraint reflected a deeper understanding of the land. The plains did not offer abundance. They demanded careful use of what little was available. Fire fit within this balance, never dominating it. Over generations, this approach became instinct. Fire was respected, controlled, and conserved. It did not define warmth. It supported it. In a world where fuel was scarce and cold relentless, survival depended on knowing when not to burn. Fire, powerful as it was, remained the last resort, a quiet ally used only when all other sources of warmth were already in place. Clothing in winter was never chosen for appearance. It was shaped by experience, refined through long seasons of cold, and trusted with survival itself. Every garment existed to trap warmth, protect skin, and move with the body rather than against it. On the plains, clothing was not fashion, it was shelter. The first layer rested close to the skin, soft and flexible. Its purpose was simple: to hold warmth without irritation, allowing the body to stay calm and steady. This layer absorbed movement and prevented friction, reducing the chance of sweat, which could quickly turn dangerous in freezing air. Over this came thicker layers, carefully selected for their ability to hold air. Warmth lived in these hidden spar. Caught between fibers and fur, the air warmed slowly, staying close to the body rather than escaping. This trapped stillness became the strongest defense against the cold. Outer layers were built to face the wind. Heavy hides blocked harsh gusts, guiding air around the body instead of letting it cut inward. The fur faced outward, allowing snow to collect and fall away without soaking through. Moisture was an enemy in winter, and clothing worked quietly to keep it out. Fit mattered deeply. Clothing was never tight. Tight garments squeezed out warm air and restricted movement. Loose designs allowed warmth to gather naturally, flowing with each breath and step. Sleeves extended past wrists. Collars rose high. Openings were minimized, sealed with careful overlaps. Hands and feet received special attention. Mittens kept fingers together, sharing warmth rather than isolating it. Footwear was layered, padded, and flexible, protecting against frozen ground while allowing blood to move freely. Cold entered the body fastest through extremities, and clothing guarded these places with care. Head coverings were essential. Heat escaped quickly through the scalp, and protecting it preserved warmth throughout the body. Fur-lined hoods softened wind and shadowed the face, reducing exposure without blocking sight. Clothing adapted with movement. During work, layers could be adjusted slightly, preventing overheating. When resting, garments were pulled close again, sealing warmth inside. His constant awareness prevented sweat and preserved energy. Even seams were placed intentionally. Stitching avoided areas of high movement, reducing wear and gaps. Repairs were made carefully, reinforcing weak spots before winter exposed them. Clothing carried the scent of smoke, hide, and life. These smells were familiar and comforting, reminders of preparation and safety. Wearing them felt grounding, like carrying the memory of warmth forward. Children learned to dress themselves early, guided gently rather than instructed harshly. They learned to feel when a layer was missing, when cold crept closer, when warmth was held properly. This awareness became instinct. When traveling, clothing became even more important. Movement generated heat, but exposure increased risk. Garments worked together to balance these forces, allowing warmth to remain close without trapping moisture. At night, clothing blended into bedding. What was worn during the day became additional layers during sleep. Nothing was removed without purpose. Every piece continued its work, quietly guarding against the cold. Clothing aged gracefully. Older pieces were reinforced, repurposed, or layered beneath newer ones. Their value did not disappear with time, it deepened. Through endless winters, these garments proved their worth. They did not promise comfort, but they delivered protection. They allowed bodies to function, breathe, and endure. In a land without trees and firewood, clothing became a portable shell. It carried warmth across frozen ground and into long nights. It trapped heat gently, patiently, turning simple materials into life-saving barriers between skin and winter's relentless cold. Breathing in deep winter was something to be learned, not assumed. At temperatures far below comfort, air itself became a challenge. Each breath carried cold sharp enough to sting, dry enough to steal moisture, and heavy enough to remind the body that even the simplest actions required care. In the open plains, the air moved constantly. Wind stripped warmth from skin and pulled heat from lungs with every careless inhale. People learned quickly that rushing breath invited pain. Slow, measured breathing became instinct, a quiet discipline practiced without thought. Cloth and fur played an important role. Scarves, hoods, and loose coverings were positioned carefully over the mouth and nose. These layers warmed the air before it reached the lungs, softening its edge. Moisture from each exhale lingered briefly in the fibers, turning the next inhale gentler, safer. Breathing through the mouth was avoided whenever possible. The nose warmed and filtered air more effectively, reducing shock to the lungs. Children were taught this early, guided patiently until it became natural. In extreme cold, even speaking was limited. Words released warm breath quickly, wasting heat. Silence preserved warmth and protected the lungs. When voices were needed, they were low and brief, carried close rather than thrown into the air. At rest, breathing slowed naturally. Bodies settled into a steady rhythm, conserving energy. Inside shelters, air felt different, heavier, warmer, alive with shared breath. This atmosphere softened each inhale, creating a small refuge from the frozen world outside. Movement required awareness. Exertion increased breathing, pulling cold air deeper into the chest. Tasks were paced carefully, allowing breath to remain controlled. Sudden bursts of effort were avoided. Steady work kept lungs safe and bodies warm. The cold had a way of making breath visible, turning it into pale clouds that drifted and disappeared. These clouds were watched closely. Thick, heavy breath meant the temperature had dropped significantly. Thin breath meant the air was still manageable. This silent observation guided decisions without words. At night, breathing became a shared presence. The slow rise and fall of many breaths filled the shelter with warmth. Exhaled air settled into layers, mixing gently, held in place by hides and structure. The cold outside pressed in, but breath inside pushed back, quietly and persistently. When traveling, people often breathed through layered coverings even when it felt restrictive. The discomfort was temporary. The protection was essential. Exposed lungs suffered quickly in extreme cold. Children learned to recognize the feeling of cold air in the chest, a warning sign not to be ignored. They were taught to stop, cover their faces, slow their breath. These lessons were given calmly, passed down through example rather than fear. Elders, whose lungs were more vulnerable, received additional care. They stayed closer to shelters, moved less in harsh conditions, and were surrounded by others who helped manage tasks. Protecting breath meant protecting life. In moments of stillness, listening replaced speaking. The wind told its own story. The crack of frozen ground, the whisper of snow moving across grass. These sounds were safer companions than conversation. Breathing in winter became an act of patience. Each inhale was intentional. Each exhale was warmth returned to the body's space. Nothing was wasted. Even sleep required attention to breath. Faces were positioned carefully, coverings adjusted to allow air while preserving warmth. Too much covering restricted breathing, too little exposed skin to frost. Balance was learned through experience. The frozen air never softened completely. It remained sharp, demanding respect. But through careful breathing, its danger was reduced. Lungs adapted, bodies endured. In a land where the cold could steal warmth with every breath, survival depended on mastering this quiet skill. Breathing became more than automatic. It became deliberate, steady, and deeply connected to the rhythm of winter life. In the bitter expanse of winter, food was not about pleasure. It was about survival. Every bite, every morsel, carried a purpose. To fuel the body against a cold that seemed to seep into bone. To provide energy that could be slowly released through long hours of stillness or gentle movement. There was no excess. There was only necessity. Meat was central. Bison, deer, and smaller game were hunted and preserved long before winter arrived. Preservation was not casual. Every piece of meat was trimmed, dried, and sometimes mixed with fat to create pemmican, a dense, energy-rich mixture that would keep for weeks, even months. Pemmican was more than food. It was concentrated warmth, stored patiently in the knowledge that each bite could mean life during the harshest days. Fat was vital. In a world without firewood and where the body had to generate its own heat, fat burned slowly and steadily, providing energy that sustained warmth over time. Meals were planned to include it deliberately. Lean meat alone would not suffice. The body needed concentrated fuel to survive the relentless cold. Roots and preserved plants were included when available, though their role was secondary. They added nutrients, variety, and sometimes comfort, but they were never the primary source of survival. In winter, calories were counted in energy and endurance, not taste. Preparation was careful and deliberate. Food was cut, portioned, and stored in layers that kept it safe from frost and scavengers. Preservation was an art. Each step ensured that nothing spoiled too quickly and nothing was wasted. Efficiency was a measure of survival, and the land did not forgive mistakes. Eating itself was measured. Meals were not rushed. Energy was needed slowly, gradually, to allow the body to absorb it fully. Eating too quickly caused discomfort. Eating too little invited weakness. Those who had lived many winters learned the rhythm naturally. Small, steady bites over long periods, matched to activity and rest. Sharing was as important as preparation. Meals were distributed carefully among families and groups, ensuring that everyone received their portion. No one ate too much at the expense of others. Hunger was dangerous, but imbalance was even more so. Communities survived because they maintained this quiet equilibrium. Cooking, when necessary, was efficient and deliberate. Boiling, drying, or softening food was done with the smallest flame possible, conserving precious fuel. The fire was never allowed to dominate the meal. Instead, it was a subtle partner, warming and preparing food without wasting heat. Children learned these lessons early. They were taught how to eat slowly, how to respect portions, how to understand the energy each bite could provide. Play and curiosity existed, but they were tempered by awareness. The cold left no room for indulgence without consequence. Even in movement, food was carried thoughtfully. Pemmican, dried meat, and small fat-rich pieces travelled with hunters, gatherers, and children walking between shelters. It was designed to last, to provide immediate energy when needed without burdening the body with excess weight or moisture. Foe. Odi was not only energy, it was warmth in tangible form. Each bite translated into heat, slowly released through blood and muscles, maintaining life when external sources of warmth were limited. Cold was relentless, but nourishment made endurance possible. At night, small rations might be consumed again, warming the stomach and body before sleep. This allowed energy to continue circulating through the night, supporting metabolism, warmth, and life itself. Timing, like preparation, was critical. The land dictated what was available, but human knowledge shaped it into survival. Hunting, preserving, storing, and rationing became a delicate balance with nature. Mistakes could be fatal, yet skill allowed people to endure winters that modern eyes would struggle to imagine. Even in scarcity, food was treated with care, respect, and patience. Nothing was discarded lightly. Each portion had purpose. Each action was mindful, slow, intentional. Through these careful routines, meals became more than sustenance. They became part of the rhythm of winter life, a steady source of energy, warmth, and quiet reassurance. Each bite fortified not only the body, but the confidence to face the cold outside. In a place where firewood was absent and frost pressed in from every side, food was the hidden flame, slow-burning, sustaining, and vital. It fueled the cold, yet it also gave life the strength to endure, quietly powering the bodies that would carry the people through endless winter days and nigh. On the frozen plains, movement was more than action, it was survival. Every step, every motion was measured and intentional, because the body itself became a source of warmth. Fire was rare. Hides protected, but could only hold heat already generated. The only reliable source came from within, carried in muscles, blood, and breath, awakened with gentle motion. The smallest gestures mattered. Shifting from one position to another inside a shelter allowed warmth to circulate between bodies. Even turning slightly while sleeping redistributed heat, reaching hands or feet that had begun to chill. Movement was never rushed. Haste wasted energy and heat. Everything was slow, deliberate, carefully tuned to maintain the fragile balance between exertion and preservation. Outside, walking required more calculation. Frozen ground resisted, snow drifted unpredictably, and wind stripped heat from exposed skin. Steps were placed with care, not too fast, not too slow. Movement generated heat, but also caused sweat, and wetness could turn into frost in an instant. Each journey was a dance of balance, motion that produced warmth without compromising it. Tasks were arranged to maximize the benefits of activity. Chopping, hauling, preparing food, or gathering materials were timed carefully. People moved consistently enough to keep warmth flowing through their bodies, but avoided sudden, frantic bursts that could lead to exhaustion. Winter dictated the rhythm. The cold was patient. Humans had to be more deliberate. Even in the shelter, movement maintained circulation. Hands, feet, and legs were shifted often. Children learned to wiggle fingers and toes gently to keep blood flowing. Adults knew where to nudge a body, adjust a blanket, or reposition a child to ensure warmth traveled evenly. The simplest motion became purposeful, a quiet method of sharing energy between people. Groups moved together strategically. Walking in pairs or clusters reduced exposure and concentrated warmth. Proximity allowed heat to be exchanged subtly. Elders and children were positioned where they could benefit most from the warmth of stronger bodies. Every step, every adjustment, served the larger purpose of maintaining life in a frozen world. Even chores were a form of energy management. Work was broken into intervals, periods of exertion to generate warmth, followed by short rests to prevent overheating. Overexertion was as dangerous as stillness. The body's energy had to be conserved while continuously producing heat. Experience taught the right balance, passed quietly through observation. During storms, movement became even more crucial. When wind howled across open plains and snow drifted into every corner, staying still was impossible. Tasks that required travel were planned meticulously. People moved in compact patterns, huddling together, shifting as one to shield weaker members, allowing the collective motion to generate warmth where it was needed most. Breathing intertwined with motion. Walking, lifting, or even turning redistributed heat, but also encouraged steadier breath, which in turn warmed the lungs. The two worked in tandem, movement producing heat, breath preserving it, creating a rhythm that carried people through long days of exposure. Children were taught movement gently, often through play that mimicked work. Simple games and tasks reinforced the natural circulation of warmth, while building awareness of the cold's presence. They learned where to step, when to pause, and how to move efficiently without waste. Play and survival were inseparable lessons. Within the shelter, movement had subtler roles. Adjusting hides, layering blankets, or rotating positions became small but vital exercises. These shifts circulated warmth through shared spaces, ensuring no part of the body or shelter cooled too quickly. Motion itself became a quiet, constant defense against winter's grip. At night, movement was minimized to conserve energy, but never completely halted. Subtle adjustments, turning or curling closer, allowed warmth to stay concentrated. Even the smallest action could mean the difference between comfort and the creeping chill of frost. The cold outside was unrelenting, but the body's motion created a bubble of resilience. Muscles worked in harmony with breath, limbs, and community, each step producing warmth that the next movement preserved. Motion was not only functional, it was life itself. Winter demanded patience, awareness, and coordination. Those who mastered movement as warmth could endure hours outside, performing essential tasks while keeping the cold at bay. It was an art, silent and ongoing, honed through years of experience. In this world, survival was rarely about strength alone. It was about understanding how energy, motion, and patience could work together to sustain life. Movement was not merely action, It was warmth made tangible, flowing through every step, every gesture, every breath, and binding bodies together against a land that offered no mercy. On the frozen plains, survival was not only a matter of strength or skill, it was also a matter of knowledge, quietly accumulated and carefully shared. Generations passed lessons along not through written words, but through stories. These stories carried the wisdom of winter, of survival, of the land itself, embedding vital truths in memory, so that every child, and eventually every adult, understood how to endure. Even before the first frost, children gathered around elders or older siblings, listening attentively as stories unfolded. Each tale was layered, often starting with something simple, a hunt, a journey, or a mistake, and gradually revealing the deeper lessons hidden within. Stories were never lectures, they were lived experiences, woven with detail that painted the world vividly, allowing listeners to see, feel, and sense the lessons themselves. A story might describe the time a group of hunters misjudged the wind and almost froze on the plains. Through the narrative, children learned the importance of pacing, of covering their faces, and of reading subtle changes in air and sky. Another tale might explain how a family used hides to trap warmth when fuel ran out. These were not just accounts, they were instructions passed gently without urgency, so the lessons could be absorbed slowly and remembered when needed. Storytelling was also rhythmic. The cadence of the speaker's voice mimicked the flow of life, guiding attention to moments of caution and moments of careful action. Pauses allowed listeners to imagine the cold biting at their own skin, to feel the pressure of wind on the plains, or the warmth of shared breath inside a shelter. Learning through imagination embedded knowledge more deeply than simple instruction ever could. Often, humour and lightness were included, not to distract from the severity of winter, but to ensure engagement. A child who laughed at a funny quirk in a tale was still absorbing its wisdom. The levity helped memories stick. Even the smallest lesson, hidden in a story's details, became easier to recall in moments of need. Stories were communal events. Families and neighbours gathered, sharing tales together. Everyone listened, contributing observations or details from their own experience. Knowledge became collective. No one survived in isolation. Wisdom flowed through the group, strengthening bonds and ensuring that the cold could not overcome them. As long as the lessons were remembered, timing of storytelling mattered. Tales were often shared during quiet moments, before sleep, when the body's energy could be restored and the mind was attentive but relaxed. Night, with its slow rhythm and soft darkness, became a natural vessel for passing wisdom. The cold outside reinforced the importance of preparation, and stories provided guidance in subtle, memorable ways. The lessons themselves were practical, focused on every aspect of survival: how to layer clothing, how to move efficiently across frozen ground, when to eat and what to eat, how to manage fire, or when to rely on body heat instead. Every story was a living manual, alive with nuance, offering both instruction and reassurance. Storytelling also preserved cultural knowledge beyond mere survival. It carried understanding of the land, the seasons, animal behaviour, and the subtle signs that could indicate danger or opportunity. Children learned to notice patterns, to sense the wind, and to feel the snow beneath their feet, all within the safe framework of a story. Repetition reinforced learning. Stories were told again and again, often with small variations, deepening understanding and embedding critical details into memory. A lesson repeated 100 times across winters became instinctive, allowing children to act correctly without conscious thought when danger arrived. Wisdom was also passed through observation, guided by the stories. A child might watch an elder demonstrate a task described in a tale, connecting a chision to narrative. Learning became both experiential and imaginative, strengthening comprehension of the harsh realities of winter. Even mistakes were preserved in story form. Failure was not hidden but narrated carefully, showing the consequences of poor judgment without blame. These tales became warnings, gentle yet clear, ensuring that future generations could avoid repeating the same errors. Elders were the storytellers, but everyone contributed to the living tapestry of knowledge. Every experience, every subtle observation added to the collective memory. Survival was a shared responsibility, carried forward through speech, rhythm, and attention. In this way, knowledge became more than practical advice. It became part of identity, a link between past, present, and future. The cold itself became a teacher, guiding the stories, shaping their lessons, ensuring that the wisdom they contained was always relevant. Stories did not simply prepare children for winter, they shaped perception, teaching patience, awareness, and respect for the land. They reinforced the understanding that survival required harmony with nature rather than defiance, and that careful observation, deliberate action, and shared knowledge were the true sources of strength. Through these quiet narratives, generations endured. The cold remained relentless, but wisdom travelled safely from mouth to ear, from heart to mind, ensuring that each person carried the lessons of the past within them. In the stillness of the shelter, with snow whispering outside, stories became as vital as food, warmth, or shelter. Quiet vessels of survival, guiding every breath, every movement, every choice. On the plains, childhood was unlike anywhere else. From their earliest days, children were shaped by the land, the seasons, and the relentless winter that arrived without warning. They were not sheltered from the cold. They were trained to live within it, to understand it, to respect it, and to thrive despite it. Warmth was taught, not given. Infants were swaddled in layers of hides, soft and thick, held close to the bodies of parents and siblings. Their breath, small and fragile, contributed to the shared warmth of the family unit. They learned early that proximity to others was life-sustaining. From the very beginning, the concept of togetherness was inseparable from survival. Movement became instinctive. Babies were carried often, strapped to their mother's back or nestled under her arm, learning the rhythm of walking and balance before they could even stand alone. Toddlers were encouraged to crawl and explore slowly, feeling the textures of snow, ice, and grass beneath their hands and feet, learning which surfaces were safe, which were cold enough to sap strength, and how to adjust instinctively. Children observed constantly. They watched elders manage fire, move with purpose, layer hides, and ration food. Each small act was a lesson, absorbed quietly over time. Stories accompanied these observations, giving context to every movement and every choice. Lessons were repeated naturally, without pressure, so that knowledge became instinctive rather than forced. Clothing was education in itself. Children were taught how to layer garments correctly, how to adjust hoods, mittens and boots to protect extremities, and how to move without losing heat. They learned that loose, breathable layers could trap warmth better than heavy, constricting ones, and that small adjustments could make the difference between comfort and frostbite. Breathing became deliberate at an early age. Little ones learned to inhale slowly through the nose, to shield their lungs from the icy air, and to exhale gently, allowing warmth to linger near the body. This skill was practiced in play and work alike, slowly becoming natural. The frozen plains taught patience and awareness with each breath. Nutrition shaped childhood too. Meals were carefully rationed, packed with fat, protein, and preserved meat to provide steady energy. Children were taught to eat slowly, appreciating every bite as both sustenance and warmth. Hunger was not punished, but understanding how to manage it became a lesson in discipline and survival. Tasks were introduced gradually. Children helped gather small items, adjust hides, and assist with minor chores, all designed to build strength, awareness, and endurance. Each action contributed to their body heat, to their understanding of movement as warmth, and to their growing knowledge survival strategies. Play was never frivolous. Games often mirrored adult activities, blending learning with energy, racing across snow, lifting small bundles, or mimicking hunting movements strengthened muscles and taught control. Even laughter had its place, releasing warmth and reinforcing the bonds of family and community. Sleep became a structured part of learning. Children were positioned carefully within layers of hides, close to others who radiated heat. Nighttime was not only rest, it was practice in maintaining warmth, awareness of body positioning, and understanding the rhythm of winter. They learned when to adjust, when to huddle, and how to conserve energy without freezing. Observation of the environment was constant. Children noticed the wind, the snow's texture, the movement of animals, and the subtle changes in temperature. They learned to predict danger, to prepare for storms, and to respect the land's power. These lessons were subtle, absorbed without pressure, embedded deeply in daily life. Storytelling reinforced these skills. Tales of past winters, of successes and failures, provided guidance in a form children could understand. They learned indirectly from mistakes made long ago, gaining insight without experiencing the consequences themselves. Each story became a mental map of survival strategies. Community shaped the upbringing of children as much as family. Elders guided them gently, peers supported one another, and everyone shared responsibility. Children were never entirely alone in learning. Survival depended on the collective, and even play reinforced these lessons. Mistakes were part of the learning process. A child who tripped on ice, got a hand cold, or misjudged movement would be corrected calmly, shown how to adjust, and allowed to try again. Winter was a patient teacher, allowing for gentle repetition until instinct took over. By adolescence, children had developed the physical endurance, awareness, and mental patience required to endure extreme cold. They moved confidently across frozen plains, adjusted clothing and breath instinctively, and contributed meaningfully to community survival. Their bodies were trained to generate and conserve warmth, their minds trained to anticipate danger, and their spirits shaped by the rhythm of winter life. Growing up on the plains was not easy, but it was intentional. Every aspect of childhood prepared them for the reality of their environment. Survival was taught, practiced, and internalized, ensuring that by the time they reached adulthood they were capable, resilient, and ready for winters that would have overwhelmed the unprepared. In this way, children were raised for the cold, not as a punishment, but as preparation. Each layer of learning, movement, and observation became part of their being. Winter was harsh, but by instilling these lessons early, the community ensured that every generation was equipped to endure, adapt, and thrive despite the frozen world outside. Winter arrived with a hush that changed everything. The first snow settled slowly on the plains, covering grass, rocks, and frozen streams in a soft, pale blanket. It wasn't just the colour that transformed the world. It was the quiet. Footsteps no longer crunched sharply. Even the wind, which could howl fiercely across open land, seemed softened, muffled under the weight of snow. Sounds faded, swallowed by the cold and the white, leaving only the faintest whispers of life around them. The silence held a kind of power. It sharpened awareness and demanded attention. Every movement, every breath, every step became noticeable. Children learned to walk carefully across the drifting powder, noticing how the snow shifted beneath their feet and how far sound travelled. Even the smallest noises, like the snap of a twig, the rustle of a hide, or a low exhale, felt louder against the stillness, teaching them that survival required patience and mindfulness. Inside shelters, the hush was different, but equally important. Thick layers of hides kept the cold at bay, but the muffled world outside pressed gently against the walls. Nights felt deeper, almost sacred. The soft whispers of wind brushing the outer walls reminded everyone of the vastness beyond, while the steady rhythm of shared breath and quiet movement inside became comforting. A reminder of warmth and safety. Children were drawn to the quiet, pressing faces against the edges of hides to see the falling snow. They learned to observe world patiently, to notice patterns in how it shifted and changed, and to understand that silence often carried more information than words ever could. Even the way animals moved across the snow left lessons, how tracks told stories, how sound travelled differently, how survival depended on careful observation. Outside, the snow altered every motion. Hunters adjusted steps to glide softly, keeping their movements deliberate to preserve warmth and remain alert. They watched for distant shadows, faint shapes, and subtle sounds that could signal prey or danger. The quiet amplified the senses, teaching that in a world blanketed by snow, the faintest detail could mean life or loss. The hush also shaped life inside. Meals were eaten slowly, each bite heard against the silence, reminding everyone of its importance. The crackle of embers, the subtle shift of blankets, and the breathing of family members became part of a shared rhythm. In this stillness, presence itself carried meaning, anchoring warmth and connection, while the cold pressed beyond the shelter walls. Storytelling during snowfall became even more vivid. Elders spoke in low, gentle tones, their words carrying over the hush of the world outside. Tales of hunts, past winters, and careful survival strategies were easier to absorb when the snow muffled distractions and focused attention. Every lesson was felt as much as heard, and children learned to read between lines, imagining danger, warmth, and skill in the frozen lands. Cape. Even small movements were amplified. Adjusting a hide, curling closer for warmth, or turning slightly on the layered bedding all affected the shared heat. The snow outside made these adjustments feel significant, reinforcing the subtle dance of life inside the shelter. Each action mattered, teaching that survival depended on attentiveness in the smallest details. The silence was not oppressive. It carried a rhythm that guided thoughts, movements, and actions. It revealed the land's quiet lessons, teaching awareness, patience, and the importance of observation. Through the hush, the people learned to anticipate storms, recognize the signs of danger, and move carefully across frozen ground. Children absorbed these lessons naturally, noticing the faint sounds of animals, the soft settling of snow, and the distant whisper of wind across the plains. They learned the subtle balance of movement and stillness, of attention and calm, and how to conserve energy while navigating the frozen world. Snow softened harsh edges and slowed the pace of life, but it did not weaken the lessons it brought. Awareness grew in the silence, focus sharpened, and the rhythms of winter life became clearer. The hush wrapped over the land, not as emptiness, but as a quiet teacher, guiding every step, breath, and motion through the cold days and long nights. Winter on the plains was never a challenge faced alone. The cold was too fierce, the snow too deep, and the wind too relentless for any single person to endure without help. Survival depended on the community, on families, neighbors, and entire groups working together, sharing warmth, knowledge, and resources. In this world, no life could thrive in isolation. Every action was quietly cooperative. Tasks were divided so that work was shared, but everyone's presence mattered. Children learned early that gathering small supplies, helping adjust hides, or assisting with chores was not play, it was survival. Each small effort contributed to the strength of the group, and the group in turn sustained each individual. Inside the shelter, closeness was both practical and symbolic. Bodies pressed together to conserve heat. Adults and children, elders and hunters formed natural patterns of warmth, circulating energy quietly through touch and presence. No one was left at the edge of a blanket or behind in the cold. This was not merely kindness, it was necessity. The survival of one depended on the warmth of many. Sharing extended to food. Every portion of preserved meat, fat, or pemmican was distributed carefully, ensuring that each member received enough energy to remain strong. Greed or neglect could cost lives. Meals were eaten slowly, but the focus was never solely on individual hunger. Each bite contributed to a shared strength, reinforcing the invisible bonds that held the community together. The cold shaped relationships as much as the land. Cooperation became instinctive. Children learned to watch and anticipate the needs of others. When an elder's hand trembled from cold, when a younger sibling needed extra layers, when the fire needed tending, these small attentions created an unspoken web of care, invisible to outsiders but essential to life. Work outside the shelter was approached collectively. Groups moved together when hunting, gathering, or preparing hides, ensuring that no one became lost or overwhelmed by the frozen landscape. Movement was synchronized, careful, and deliberate. Heat was shared, effort was shared, and vigilance was shared. Every individual's safety was intertwined with the group's awareness. Decision-making followed similar principles. Plans for food, travel, or tending to animals were discussed communally. Elders guided based on experience, but younger members' observations were considered as well. No one acted recklessly or in isolation. The cold had no patience, and unity was a silent, constant rule. Even during leisure, cooperation persisted. Play among children often mimicked adult activities, teaching them the rhythm of work and the importance of collaboration. Laughter, movement, and curiosity became tools for learning, subtly reinforcing the idea that survival was woven through shared effort rather than individual achievement. The shelter itself reflected community priorities. Sleeping arrangements placed those most vulnerable in the center of warmth, surrounded by others whose bodies provided steady heat. Every position had purpose, and everyone's placement contributed to collective survival. The cold pushed inward, but the community absorbed it, distributing warmth evenly across all members. Lessons were passed quietly from one generation to the next, emphasizing that no skill, no preparation, and no bravery alone could guarantee survival. Strength was measured in the ability to contribute to and rely on the group. Children observed, learned, and practiced the subtle gestures of care, sharing hides, adjusting blankets, passing food, all small acts that ensured the survival of more than just themselves. Challenges reinforced this interdependence. Storms, bitter winds, and sudden drops in temperature tested everyone at once. Those who understood the importance of community thrived, while isolation risked exhaustion, frostbite, or worse. Each individual's actions affected everyone else. Every moment of attentiveness, every shared responsibility, had consequences that extended beyond oneself. Communication was often quiet and subtle. A glance, a nod, a slight adjustment of posture conveyed meaning efficiently. There was no need for harsh commands or reminders. The rhythm of life in winter demanded attentiveness and responsiveness. The cold taught that coordinated effort was more reliable than force or speed. Even in moments of reflection or rest, the presence of the group mattered. Silence became a shared space where breath, warmth, and steady heartbeats reinforced the sense of security. Comfort was collective. Peace was collective. Lie. Fae itself was collective. Through generations, this understanding shaped identity. People learned that survival was never about personal strength alone, but about how one could move, breathe, and act in harmony with others. Each individual's endurance was inseparable from the endurance of the whole. The cold remained harsh, unyielding, and unpredictable. Yet life persisted, not through luck, skill, or fire alone, but through shared warmth, shared effort, and shared care. The community was the shelter, the fire, and the lesson, quietly teaching that in the frozen world of the plains, togetherness was the truest form of survival. Winter on the plains was not only a test of the body, it was a test of the mind. The night stretched long and silent, fading slowly into pale mornings, and darkness seemed endless under the heavy snow and clouded skies. With little light, harsh cold, and a world stripped of warmth, survival demanded more than heat, food, or movement. It demanded quiet resilience, patience, and the ability to endure without surrendering to despair. Even within shelters, the nights were difficult. The cold crept in through tiny gaps in hides and along the floor, finding every weakness and demanding attention. Bodies pressed together for warmth, yet still the mind noticed the darkness, the hush, and the endless repetition of frozen hours. Thoughts could wander dangerously if left unchecked, so mental discipline became part of survival as much as any physical skill. Story. And songs carried particular weight during these nights. Elders would quietly recount lessons, myths, or tales of past winters, filling the silence with rhythm and meaning. Children listened, not just for entertainment, but for guidance. The cadence of words helped steady hearts and minds, providing a framework of security and understanding in a world that might otherwise feel hostile and unending. Sleep was a fragile ally. Darkness could be comforting in its consistency, but it could also be relentless. People learned to rest in short cycles, waking naturally to tend to fires, adjust hides, or redistribute warmth. The body learned rhythm in repetition, while the mind practiced patience, understanding that time in winter was measured differently than in summer. Nights could feel infinite, but within routine and quiet, endurance grew. Mental strength was also about controlling fear. Every sound, crackling ice, distant wind, shifting snow, could startle, but experience taught that many threats were small or imagined. Focus on immediate needs, small actions, and shared presence prevented anxiety from taking hold. Awareness rather than worry became the default. Children observed closely, learning by example. They noticed how adults managed long hours of darkness, how steady hands and calm voices maintained comfort and reassurance. Even simple gestures, covering a sibling with extra hide, offering a piece of preserved meat, adjusting the sleeping space, became lessons in fortitude, teaching that resilience often comes through care, calm, and patience. Routine helped maintain stability. Tasks were paced deliberately, checking supplies, maintaining small embers, repairing clothing or bedding, or simply shifting for warmth. Repetition created a rhythm that carried the mind through long nights, giving structure and preventing restlessness. Even minor accomplishments, aligning hides, distributing warmth, or sharing a meal, strengthened morale and reminded everyone that they could influence their environment despite the harshness outside. The cold also demanded imagination. Children learned to create small games or stories in their minds, quiet adventures that occupied the hours without expending unnecessary energy. Adults sometimes participated in this subtle play, using mental exercises to pass time and maintain focus. Creativity became a tool for endurance, giving purpose to what might otherwise feel like infinite monotony. Isolation could be the hardest challenge. Even within the community, moments arose when an individual felt the weight of winter pressing inward. Here, attention to breath, small movements, and observation of others' presence became crucial. Sharing warmth, offering reassurance, or simply listening to another's quiet breathing maintained cohesion, preventing despair from taking hold. Mental strength was as much collective as it was individual. The nights also sharpened awareness. Sleep cycles, wind changes, and animal movements became lessons in patience and observation. The mind learned to anticipate patterns, understand subtle cues, and prepare for action without haste. This anticipation, practiced through repeated winters, became instinctive, allowing individuals to act calmly under pressure. Even the smallest comforts played a role in sustaining mental strength. The soft glow of embers, the gentle warmth of shared bodies, the texture of hides, and the smell of preserved food reminded the mind of stability, safety, and continuity. These constants offered reassurance, grounding everyone in a familiar rhythm despite the endless night Mental endurance was intertwined with physical endurance. Each breath, each small motion, each effort to stay warm was also a test of focus. Restless thoughts could waste energy and distract attention from essential tasks. By maintaining calm awareness, individuals preserved both heat and resolve, ensuring survival across hours and days when darkness and cold seemed unrelenting. Through repeated winters, mental strength became a quiet, invisible skill. It was cultivated patiently, taught through example, stories, and practice. Those who mastered it moved through long nights with steadiness, guided by experience, presence, and observation, rather than fear or impatience. The endless nights could have crushed the unprepared, yet within the rhythm of shared presence, careful attention, and purposeful activity, minds remained strong. Strength was built slowly, quietly, in every mere short breath, in every deliberate movement, and in every moment of awareness that winter demanded without fail. Life on the frozen plains demanded understanding rather than resistance. The cold, the wind, and the relentless snow were not enemies to be defeated. They were forces to be respected and learned from. Those who survived did so by adapting, observing the land, and adjusting their actions to fit the rhythms of nature instead of attempting to dominate it. Shelters reflected this philosophy. Teepees and other structures were designed with the wind in mind, angled to divert gusts and retain heat where it mattered most. Openings were small and carefully positioned, allowing smoke to escape while minimizing the loss of warmth. Hides were layered to trap air, insulating against the cold without requiring firewood. Every design decision accepted nature's power rather than challenging it directly. Clothing was another expression of adaptation. Garments were made from animal hides and furs, chosen for their insulation and layered to trap warmth efficiently. Breathable layers allowed bodies to maintain heat without overheating, while hoods, mittens, and boots minimized exposure. Adaptation meant observing the land and weather, understanding how temperatures changed, and adjusting clothing to maintain balance with the environment, rather than attempting to control it. Food practices followed the same principle. Hunting, preserving, and rationing were not acts of dominance, but of partnership. The land provided resources, and careful planning ensured that each animal and plant was used efficiently. Meat and fat were stored and distributed with intention, supporting body warmth and energy while respecting the cycles of nature that made survival possible. Movement across the frozen plains required constant adaptation. Walking, hunting, and transporting supplies were done with awareness of wind, snow, and terrain. Each step was deliberate, conserving energy while generating warmth. People learned to read tracks in the snow, anticipate the behavior of animals, and adjust their routes and pace according to changing conditions. Adaptation became instinctive, a quiet dialogue between humans and the land. Even sleep reflected an understanding of nature. Positions were adjusted to conserve warmth, bodies were layered closely, and hides were arranged to maximize insulation. The rhythm of rest aligned with the natural cycles of cold and wind, allowing energy to be preserved and heat to circulate. Adaptation did not require comfort. It required respect, attentiveness, and responsiveness to the environment. Children were taught these lessons early. They observed the actions of adults, listened to stories of winters past, and gradually learned how to move, dress, eat, and rest in harmony with the land. Mistakes were corrected calmly, offering guidance that emphasized learning and adjustment rather than punishment. The philosophy of adaptation became part of daily life. shaping decisions, actions, and priorities from a young age. Mental adjustment was as crucial as physical adaptation. Anticipating storms, recognizing signs of temperature shifts, and remaining patient during prolonged harsh conditions were necessary for survival. Anxiety or impulsive actions could waste energy or risk frostbite, so quiet observation, careful planning, and patience were cultivated through experience and storytelling. Tasks were sequenced with adaptation in mind. Fire was used sparingly, only when necessary, as body heat was a more reliable source of warmth. Food was prepared efficiently, clothing layered appropriately, and movement coordinated with environmental conditions. Every decision balanced necessity with nature's constraints, reflecting a deep understanding that survival relied on working with the environment, not against it. Even community life depended on adaptation. Sharing warmth, dividing tasks, and communicating silently or subtly allowed the group to respond effectively to changes in weather. No individual could overcome the cold alone, but a cohesive group that observed and adjusted together thrived despite the harshest conditions. Adapting also meant respecting the cycles of animals and plants. Hunting followed patterns, ensuring that resources were sustainable and available when needed most. Seasonal behaviors were observed, guiding decisions on travel, storage, and preparation. Nature was not something to conquer. It was a partner whose rhythms informed every action. The land, in turn, shaped culture and identity. Winter dictated the pace of life, the structure of shelter, the design of clothing, and the flow of daily routines. By accepting and understanding these constraints, people created strategies that allowed endurance, comfort, and continuity. Adaptation became second nature, embedded in every movement, every breath, and every decision. Through years of repeated winters, adaptation became instinct. Decisions were made intuitively, guided by observation, experience, and subtle cues from the environment. Those who mastered adaptation could survive storms, deep snow, and extreme cold without panic, relying on understanding rather than force. Every act, from tending embers to layering hides, from walking across frozen ground to rationing food, reflected a choice to work with nature instead of against it. Survival was not about dominance or resistance. It was about humility, attentiveness, and skillful adjustment. The cold could not be tamed, but life continued. Each layer of clothing, each careful movement, each shared breath was part of a larger strategy of harmony with the land. By adapting rather than fighting, people endured, finding ways to thrive in a world that demanded patience, observation, and respect. On the endless, frozen plains, survival alone was not enough. Harsh winds, relentless snow, and temperatures that sank far below what most could endure created a world where only the prepared could company. Yet the communities who understood the land, learned its rhythms, and adapted to its demands did more than endure. They thrived in conditions that would have claimed the unprepared. Thriving began with knowledge. Every winter, lessons from the past guided actions. Families understood how to layer hides, preserve food, and move across snow without wasting energy. Children absorbed these lessons naturally, watching elders perform essential tasks with care and precision. Those who had grown in the rhythm of the plains acted instinctively, while outsiders or the unprepared struggled to meet even basic needs. Food played a central role. Pemmican, dried meat, and fat-rich provisions provided steady energy to generate warmth throughout the day. Those who knew how to ration properly, balance nutrition, and conserve resources could endure long stretches without succumbing to cold or fatigue. Energy management was as crucial as shelter, and mastery over it allowed communities to maintain strength while others would weaken. Shelters and clothing amplified survival into thriving. Teepees, insulated with multiple layers of hides, held warmth from body heat efficiently. Garments made of furs and skins were not merely protection, they created an environment where motion and breath worked in harmony to sustain heat. Those who mastered these techniques moved with ease, their bodies' efficient engines producing warmth while conserving energy. Movement itself became a source of advantage. Experienced hunters and gatherers moved across frozen plains with precision, reading snow patterns, wind shifts, and subtle signs of animal behavior. They traveled efficiently, avoiding unnecessary exertion, while newcomers struggled to balance heat, energy, and safety. Knowledge and adaptation allowed those raised in these conditions to accomplish tasks that would overwhelm the untrained. Mental resilience amplified the difference. Long nights and endless storms could drain both body and spirit, but those familiar with the routines of winter remained focused. Patience, observation, and calm became second nature, allowing action under pressure and reducing panic. Mental fortitude created stability in the chaos of snow, cold, and darkness, giving them the advantage over those who relied solely on instinct or brute strength. The community itself strengthened individual thriving. Cooperative strategies, sharing warmth, distributing food, coordinating tasks, and watching for danger, meant that the group could endure challenges that would overwhelm solitary efforts. Every person contributed, every small action reinforced another, and in this shared rhythm, life could not only continue but flourish. Hunting and foraging also revealed the advantage of experience. Understanding animal behavior, migration patterns, and shelter needs allowed some families to find abundant resources while others struggled. Timing, observation, and adaptation turned scarcity into opportunity. Those who mastered these skills found consistent food supplies even in the harshest winters, reinforcing health, strength, and energy. Even children learned to thrive. Play and daily activities were infused with survival lessons. They moved across snow deliberately, adjusted layers instinctively, and understood the subtle signals of the environment. By adulthood, they were capable of tasks that outsiders might find exhausting or impossible, moving efficiently and conserving energy while maintaining warmth and focus. The land itself became a partner to those who understood it. Snowdrifts, frozen streams, and wind patterns were navigated with precision. While others faltered, those attuned to nature's rhythm could take advantage of shelter, hidden pathways, and the energy-saving strategies the environment offered. Mastery over these subtle details separated thriving from mere endurance. Even in extreme storms, thriving was possible. While unprepared travelers might freeze or lose resources, communities practiced coordination. Small groups moved carefully, shared heat, and completed essential tasks efficiently. Every element, clothing, food, movement, observation, worked together to transform a deadly environment into one where life continued with stability and quiet competence. Stories and memory reinforced thriving. Lessons of past winters guided present action, from managing embers to rationing supplies. Knowledge accumulated over generations became a map of survival, giving every individual the tools to act decisively and effectively. Experience allowed people to anticipate danger, maintain energy, and capitalize on opportunities where others would falter. Thriving was also measured by comfort, however subtle. While the world outside remained harsh and unforgiving, those skilled in survival could find moments of warmth, rest, and even quiet pleasure in routine and observation. Life became sustainable, steady, and confident in a place that would otherwise be hostile. Through repeated winters, the distinction between survival and thriving became clear. Survival depended on basic skills, resilience, and endurance. Thriving required mastery, knowledge, mental strength, cooperation, and instinctual understanding of the land and its rhythms. Those who achieved it moved with purpose. Heat flowed efficiently through their bodies, and energy was preserved even in the coldest conditions. Every day of winter reinforced these lessons. Each successful hunt, each careful adjustment of clothing, every shared breath in a shelter strengthened the capacity to endure and excel. While the plains could claim the unprepared, those who had been raised, taught, and experienced its harsh rhythms found ways to flourish where others would perish. Even as storms raged, wind whipped, and snow deepened, thriving families maintained warmth, energy, and morale. The cold remained unyielding, but understanding, preparation, and cooperation ensured life not only continued but quietly flourished, in ways the untrained could scarcely imagine. The lessons of winter were never forgotten. They travelled quietly from one generation to the next, woven into daily life stories and practice. Every habit, every gesture, every careful movement had been honed over decades, centuries even, creating a living legacy of knowledge. Children who learned to adjust hides, layer clothing, read the snow, or pace their steps carried more than survival skills. They carried the wisdom of those who had endured the same frozen plains long before them. Storytelling remained the heart of this transmission. Around fires or within shelters, elders recounted winters past, teaching lessons without the need for lectures. Tales described hunters who misjudged the wind, families who failed to ration food properly, or children who learned patience too late. Through these narratives, listeners absorbed practical strategies alongside subtle moral lessons about patience, observation, and respect for the land. Stories were memory made tangible, preserving experience in ways that could be recalled when cold or fatigue pressed hardest. The lessons were practical, embedded in every action. Knowledge of layering hides, distributing warmth, or pacing exertion was repeated until it became instinct. Children imitated adults, observing subtle shifts in posture, breath, and gesture. Over time, these actions became second nature, allowing future generations to endure winters that would have overwhelmed untrained Bodhi. Skills passed quietly, woven into the rhythm of daily life, rather than taught through direct instruction alone. Beyond physical survival, lessons also carried mental resilience. Generations learned to endure long nights, harsh winds, and unpredictable storms without panic. Calm observation, patience, and measured decision-making were as essential as food or shelter. These habits became part of identity, shaping how people thought, moved, and breathed in a world defined by cold. The capacity to remain focused and deliberate was passed along with each story and every observed action. Even the land itself became a teacher. Knowledge of animal behavior, snowdrift patterns, and wind directions was preserved through practice and memory. Hunters learned to anticipate migration, to recognize signs in the terrain, and to adjust their actions accordingly. The environment became a silent partner in education, providing feedback that reinforced every lesson shared by elders. Community life strengthened the transmission of wisdom. Each member contributed observations, corrections, and small insights. Knowledge was never static. It grew with each winter, adjusted to new conditions, and adapted to the needs of the group. Children learned not only from elders but from siblings, peers, and neighbors, creating a web of shared understanding that ensured no lesson was lost. Mistakes were preserved as part of the legacy. When errors occurred, when fires failed, food spoiled, or a child misjudged snow, these experiences were recounted carefully, showing the consequences without blame. Each misstep became a cautionary tale, reinforcing the importance of attentiveness, patience, and care. Learning from failures was as important as imitating success, and both became part of the inheritance carried forward through repetition, practice, and storytelling. Survival strategies became embedded in culture. Skills that once required conscious effort became instinctive. Children who grew up on the plains could adjust layers, move efficiently, conserve heat, and ration food without hesitation. Their bodies, minds, and instincts carried the collective memory of generations, allowing them to navigate winters that would otherwise overwhelm anyone untrained. Even small gestures were meaningful. The way a hide was folded, a fire tended, or a path through snow selected carried lessons about efficiency, caution, and care. These nuances, imperceptible to outsiders, ensured that wisdom was preserved in every movement and decision. Over time, the knowledge formed a continuous chain, linking past and future. Elders became guides, children became practitioners, and every winter reinforced the cycle. Survival was no longer individual, it was communal, intergenerational, and inseparable from the rhythms of the land. Those who carried these lessons forward did more than live. They became part of a living tradition, shaped by cold, strengthened by observation, and guided by experience. The far Ozone plains continued to challenge, but generations adapted, endured, and thrived. Each step, breath, and careful action reflected a lineage of wisdom. Every story told, every lesson demonstrated, every movement practiced was part of a timeless education. In the quiet of winter, with snow drifting outside and embers glowing faintly, life moved forward, sustained by knowledge that had survived storms, darkness, and decades, ensuring that the ways of endurance and resilience would continue to guide those yet to come.